This is Bigger Questions with your host, Robert Martin.
Welcome to Bigger Questions. Today's show recorded live at Mudgeeraba Uniting Church on the Gold Coast. Today's big question, why fair trade? We asked this question today to John Martin. John worked for nearly 40 years as a Uniting Church minister and aged care chaplain. He is now retired and spends his time working as a fair trade advocate on the Gold Coast in Queensland. And John is actually my dad, and he joins me now. Please welcome John Martin.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Robert, for this opportunity to be interviewed for your program. Thank you.
Oh, that's fine as well. Well, Dad, John, suppose I can call you Dad, because you are. Welcome to Bigger Questions.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's really good.
Yeah, excellent. So, Dad, you're retired now, but you spend your time now as a fair trade advocate. So what does that mean?
What it means, basically, I spend my time going around trying to talk to congregations, church people, about fair trade and how it grows out of the gospel of Jesus Christ and how it can make a difference to our shopping and also a difference to the people of the world. And take every opportunity to write letters to newspapers and so on about fair trade.
To kick off Bigger Questions, we like to ask a couple of smaller questions. We do try to have a bit of fun on the show. And today we're talking with John Martin, who happens to be my dad, about fair trade. Now, so Dad, there's someone who is a fair trade advocate and one who enjoys a good cup of coffee. Our smaller questions to you today are, how much do you know about the global coffee industry? Now, do you feel qualified?
Well, I do, because I have one coffee every morning, a whole plunger full. I only have one.
So how many glasses, how many cup mugs is that?
About between 2 and 3.
Okay, right, for your 1 cup a day.
1 cup a day.
Yeah. Okay, there's 2 questions in our smaller questions, and we'll see how you go. Question 1. Approximately how many cups of coffee are consumed in the world every day? And I'll accept your answer to the nearest billion.
I suppose 2 or 3 billion.
Yeah, okay.
You said the nearest billion.
That's right, yeah. Do you want to narrow it down? Which one? 2 billion. And that, yeah, actually, that's correct, yes. It's 2.25 billion, yeah. So that works out to be about 820 billion cups of coffee consumed each year. That's a lot of caffeine.
It is, a lot of coffee.
That's right, yeah, and you help that.
I do my bit. I do my bit.
You sound like you do. Okay, question 2. How many farmers produce the world's coffee? I accept your answer probably to the nearest 10 million.
30 million?
Well, I think we'll give that. The answer is actually 25 million. So, yes, there's... well, why not? 25 million smallholder farmers produce 80% of the world's coffee, but many of them fail to earn a reliable living from coffee. So, congratulations, Dad. Out of our smaller questions, you got 2 out of 2 of our smaller questions right. Another round of applause. So, Dad, coffee is very popular, produced by a large number of small producers. So what impact does this have on the coffee producers themselves?
Well, the coffee producer, for them, it's their livelihood.
Yeah.
And if they make money out of growing the coffee, if they can cover their costs and make a surplus to feed their families and clothe their families and send their children to school, then they're doing all right. If they don't, if the world coffee price falls and they don't receive a proper return for their coffee, well, they become impoverished.
They're vulnerable.
And they're very much exposed to poverty. And so what fair trade does is it guarantees a minimum wage for the coffee producers, so that they get a guaranteed minimum wage. Even if the world price falls, they get a minimum price for the coffee that they produce. That's right. Yep.
So why is that needed then? Is it to offset this volatility in the world coffee price?
I mean, it's the same in every industry. If you're mining for iron ore in Australia and the price of iron ore drops a bit, you don't pay the workers less. The workers still get paid their normal wage for the work they do. And so it's the same with the coffee market. Fair trade, certified coffee, pays the workers, the farmers, the people who produce it, a minimum guaranteed wage.
So this is why fair trade is needed, do you think, certainly for coffee producers?
It is, because otherwise corporations that are marketing coffee will want to make as much money as they can out of it. And it's not just coffee, of course. It's other products like tea and chocolate, and some of the other essentials of life for many people. And they're the ones that are readily available in supermarkets here in Australia.
Yeah, yeah. So what then distinguishes fair trade from other initiatives which are designed to help the poor?
Well, it guarantees the price. It also ensures safe working conditions for people in an environmentally sustainable way. No child labour is involved where a fair trade mark is involved. And there's sustainability in that a premium is paid, a fair trade premium is paid to the community so that the people benefit. They can build schools or hospitals or water supplies. And with a fair trade mark, it's the people themselves that make that decision, not a corporation that makes the decision for them.
So they get some extra money in their communities for whatever community development project they'd like
Yes, that's right.
allocate it to. Okay. So now the Harvester judgment in Australia was a landmark industrial relations case where a minimum wage was established. The judgment determined that the minimum wage should be a fair and reasonable wages for an unskilled male worker that was sufficient for a human being in a civilised community to support a wife and 3 children in frugal comfort. So is that something along the lines of what fair trade is trying to achieve, a bit like a minimum wage on a global scale?
It is, so that people can live. The quaint wording of 100 years ago was frugal comfort. And of course there was one wage earner in the family in those days, and the minimum was probably less than we would expect today.
Yeah.
But
Probably didn't get too much smashed avocado for that.
no, it was a landmark decision. And of course in Australia we've followed that on with the basic wage and the minimum wage that we have today. And yet we experience all the time companies here in Australia who want to try and undercut those wages. If people come from another country, they don't speak English as a first language, they don't understand the laws very well, they're vulnerable to being taken advantage of here in this country where we have these rules. So if it's bad here, imagine what it must be like in some of the countries where they don't have these principles as part of their government.
And you have lots of vulnerable people who are looking for a living, I suppose.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. Now, fair trade now certifies many billions of dollars worth of goods across the world. Maybe take us back to the start. How did fair trade begin?
Well, fair trade goes right back a long, long way. I mean, in the Bible, you'll find in the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the people that were employed early in the day were agreed a wage for that day, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, right back there. That's 2,000 years ago. And both Paul and Jesus at one point say that a labourer is worthy of their pay. And so it goes right back into biblical times.
Yeah.
And in recent history, 100 or so years ago, George Cadbury, who gave his name, of course, to the famous brand of chocolate,
One of life's essentials.
was one of life's essentials, was horrified to learn that his workers in Africa were being treated virtually as slaves. And George Cadbury was a Christian, he was a Quaker, and he built very fine village for his workers at Bournemouth in England and looked after them. And when he discovered that part of his supply chain was being provided by slave labour, he was very upset indeed. And so he raised their wages. He made sure that they were treated properly, they were remunerated correctly for the work that they did. Now, George Cadbury and the Cadbury family have lost control of that company, and things aren't quite the way they used to be, perhaps, because large corporations have a responsibility to pay their shareholders as much as the shareholders want, which is as much as they can get.
Yeah.
And therefore that reduces the cost of the inputs, including the wages of the people who provide the goods that go into the products.
So what were the origins then of the modern fair trade movement?
Well, post-war, it took off, and particularly in the 1970s in the UK, Tier Fund and Tradecraft were established. They were Christian organisations, and they saw that there were injustices in the supply chain of tea and coffee and so on. And so, for example, Tradecraft was established and exists in England and the United Kingdom very much within the churches, even today. And a lot of churches have Tradecraft reps and they have Tradecraft stalls And Oxfam, of course, too, has its origins in the Christian church. And in Australia for today, Oxfam is one of the most highly regarded sellers, retailers of fair trade products.
Now, fair trade, as you've mentioned, is primarily associated with coffee, as you obviously enjoy. But fair trade is much broader, as you've alluded to before. Fair trade is much broader than just coffee.
Yes, it's every product. Every product imaginable has a supply chain. For example, cotton. I mean, if you go into a shop here in Robina Town Centre or somewhere like that, or anywhere, and you see T-shirts on special for $5 or $10, new T-shirts, not in the op shop, but new ones, you think, well, how much did the workers get who produced the cotton that goes into these products? So it's in cotton products, and in fact, there are some countries in the world who are deliberately keeping the wages of their workers low so that they, as a country, can maximise their profits from the sale of cotton, I mean.
But it's also like handicrafts and all sorts of other things.
Well, handicrafts.
That's often where a lot of fair trade began.
Well, a lot of people, there are a lot of people who are sourcing handicrafts in third world countries, and they're often Fair Trade Association members, and they're certified by the World Fair Trade Organisation, and they have a rigid certification system. A lot of people will go and see that there is a need. For example, in a number of countries today, there are women who are being trafficked and into prostitution, and so people will come along and, using maybe recycled goods, enable these women to have a worthwhile income through producing craft items that can be for sale in a country like Australia.
It really gives them alternative income generation sources.
It does. And it also provides beautiful craft items and gift items for people here in Australia.
Now, it all sounds very nice in theory, but aside from making us feel better, what difference does fair trade actually make? I mean, does it actually work?
Well, it does work, yes, because there are rigorous tests to ensure that it does work, and there are a lot of stories of people coming out of third world countries where communities have been lifted from poverty through trade rather than just aid, through trade into a state of well-being in their community.
I mean, but fair trade is not without its critics, and a number of the claims of the impact of fair trade are hotly contested. Some claim that the benefits are exaggerated, that the costs of certification are too high, and that it doesn't actually help, certainly in the case of coffee, the poorest of farmers. So how do you respond to the criticisms of fair trade? Well, there's
a couple of things to say to that. First of all, I'd want to know who's making the criticisms, because are they people who have a different axe to grind? For example, if you're saying we want all the products on the supermarket shelf to be fair trade, the people that are making a lot of money in third world countries are not going to be happy. They're going to say, well, we want to circumvent that, so how do we do it? We try to discredit the fair trade movement or any particular product.
I mean, some of the claims have been made by academics in universities.
Yes. Well, you can be sure that there are rigorous tests. The World Fair Trade Organisation has 10 principles of fair trade that people must meet, and also the fair trade, the mark, that blue and green and black mark that's familiar on products in supermarkets, they have a very high standards of testing. And it could well be, like in every system, things don't work perfectly.
Yeah.
So it's quite, I mean, after all, we're human people and we're not all perfect. Mistakes are made. But generally, overall, the great evidence is that people are being lifted from poverty to a life of frugal comfort. Yeah.
Or also in the case certainly of handicrafts, etc., employment opportunities have been made,
yes, which
they otherwise wouldn't have, and they'd be left in prostitution or destitute.
Yeah, well, to stop the traffic, people promote fair trade chocolate, for example, because a lot of children that have been used in the cocoa production industry have been trafficked. And of course, also they promote products made by particularly women who have been rescued from prostitution.
So is fair trade then the only answer to fighting poverty?
Oh, no. Of course, I mean, we have to contribute directly. A lot of people contribute directly to poverty. Some people are so poor they don't even have the opportunity of having a job. For example, if you look at the people of Somaliland at the moment, where they're just victims of drought and warfare and they're living on the edge, by giving to organisations that are helping them directly, obviously helps them.
So that's direct aid.
So direct aid is important. But a lot of people can be helped through trade rather than aid. Tradecraft spells its name TRAID, CRAFT, trade rather than aid directly.
So what difference then can someone listening make?
Well, the difference they can make is that when they go shopping, they can go to their supermarket and roam up and down the aisles, and particularly in the tea, coffee and chocolate aisles, they will find the familiar fair trade mark, and they can be guaranteed that that is helping some people in a distant land far, far away, and they can buy that and eat chocolate and drink coffee and tea with a clear conscience.
But doesn't it cost more?
It used to. It used to be more expensive, but it's not necessarily more expensive these days. In fact, I think you'll find that the prices of tea and coffee and chocolate are very competitive these days. And of course, it's a motivation. I mean, everybody wants to bargain. You go to the supermarket and you want to get the cheapest product you can. I mean, look at milk in Australia. I mean, we become very critical of the large supermarkets because they are paying milk producers less than the cost of production. Most milk producers in Australia today are going broke, quite pure and simply. But when you think about it, there are alternatives in the supermarket. You don't have to buy the cheapest milk. You can buy, and if you do a little research, you'll find out which local dairy near you is owned by the farmers, and the farmers receive a fair return. So it happens in this country, and it can happen by discerning with those other products like tea, coffee and chocolate.
So it's the same principle in the local dairy industry.
Same
in
principle,
some ways, just people getting paid. I suppose a frugal comfort, perhaps.
Frugal comfort. Yeah. Well, the poor old farmers aren't living in comfort at all. No. They're more than frugal. So
what got you interested in fair trade in the first place?
Well, I suppose it's an interesting thing because way back in the early 1980s, the World Development Tea Cooperative in Australia were marketing a tea that they called broken orange pekoe in woven baskets, and we were in a rural town at the time, and we got hold of some of these and started selling them amongst the people of the church, believing that by buying that tea, they were helping the people who produced it. And when we went to England to live as a family in the mid-1980s, my wife, Nolene, your mother, found a tradecraft catalogue, came into our home one day, and she opened it up and they were appealing for volunteers. And she said, I think I can do that. And our life changed from that day.
I remember it quite clearly.
Yes.
So tell people listening, how did our lives change?
Well, Nolene became a tradecraft rep in Shropshire. She was the only one of two in the whole of the county of Shropshire in England. And she'd go around talking to groups about fair trade and taking these products with her and selling them. And often we'd go off as a family to these functions as well. And we had a little tiny car, mini metro car, and the five of us would squeeze in there. It was only a two-door car too, so we put you people in the back and then load you up with fair trade products in boxes. All the light ones, the baskets and things like that. We didn't put the heavy
like
ones
fair
like
trade at the time
the
for us
honey
at
and
the
the
time.
sugar. It was child labour, I know. And then we came back to Australia and discovered that there was very little in the way of fair trade here in Australia. But in more recent years, it's grown, and we've been pleased to see that. And Nolene was very much part of establishing some fair trade festivals in New South Wales.
Yes, it was certainly almost a family affair.
It was
for us as growing up.
Yeah.
I remember I have lots of memories of
But
carrying
apart from
boxes and selling things.
the motivation for it comes from a reading of the Bible and an understanding of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Because Christians believe that Jesus died on the cross for them and he rose again for them and we're saved from our sins. But there's a response that's involved with that, and it's an ethical response. And there's ethical responses in the way we live our lives in our community, but it's also ethical responses on a global scale. And I think we can read the Bible in a number of places and find that there is a bias towards the poor. And
so this is a strong motivation for you in your passion for fair trade.
yes, very much so. There are about 2,000 passages in the Bible where the poor are referred to, and the widows and the orphans are treated fairly in the people of Israel. Even the story of the people of Israel themselves, released from slavery. God hears their cries in slavery, and he wants them to be free from slavery, which is the extreme form of unfair trade, of course, when the person is totally enslaved.
Today's big question is, why fair trade? And perhaps unsurprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, the Bible offers perspectives on this question. In the New Testament book of James, written almost as a form of wisdom literature or good advice for living life well, James writes some strong words to the rich in chapter 5. He says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes." So, Dad, John, is James saying that it's bad to be rich?
Well, I don't think it's saying it's bad to be rich. I think it's saying bad to be rich if you're not considering other people as well. But then Matthew, at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, where John the Baptist was talking to the people, and they said, well, what are we supposed to do? And he said, well, those who have got 2 garments, give one to the poor. And he told the soldiers not to be happy with their wages and not to expect anything more. So right there at the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry, as Jesus is being baptised, is that social dimension of sharing. And I've got more than one coat and one shirt and all those sorts of things, and I suppose most people in Australia have. And yet we still have that responsibility to ensure that others don't go without.
So as you've sort of mentioned, so compared to the rest of the world, we in Australia are very wealthy. So these words apply to us?
Well, they do apply to us if we don't take notice of those who are impoverished, because James goes on to say, "Listen, the wages of the labourers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." James has been critical of people who are doing the harvest, but their wages are being withheld. And those voices of those people have been heard by God, not just by a trade union or anything like that, but by God himself. And that is what is condemning the wealthy people. I think it's fine to be wealthy. Some of the wealthiest people in the world have also been the most generous people.
Well, that passage in James 5:4 talks about the wages that have been failed to pay. So you see that there's a connection there with the principles of fair trade?
Very much so, yes. Paying a fair wage for the work that somebody does. And that's very clear. The wages of the labourers who mowed the fields are being withheld, kept back.
So there's an issue of justice here, or fairness?
Very much so. Justice, fairness, and equal sharing of the good things that God has given to us.
So isn't the principle harder to recognise in our culture because the supply chain is often invisible to us? In the ancient world, you could have seen the harvesters who provided your food, but for us that is invisible. We just see a product and a price. So is this a problem, and is this something that fair trade is trying to overcome? Well,
it is, because when we go shopping, we're blind. We go up and down the aisles, but we don't see the people behind the products. We don't know. You think of how many thousands of products you walk past as you walk up and down supermarket aisles, and you think of the people behind those products, the people that did the work to manufacture those products. And you ask questions like, well, how were they treated? Were they given a fair wage? Did they work under healthy conditions? Was it in an environmentally sustainable way?
Well, we just don't know, do we?
We don't know. And that's where the fair trade mark comes in, because that you do know. And so if you're choosing between one coffee and another, and the price is similar and the taste is similar, then the fair trade one can be sure that the people behind it received a fair wage for the work that they did.
So James then continues his warning in verse 5, where he says, "You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." So is this a warning to the rich who benefit from the injustices of the poor?
Well, I think it is, and it's only following on from what Jesus said, where the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man lived in great comfort, and at the door, unseen by him, was this poor beggar And when they died, the rich man went to Hades, the poor man went to heaven. And the rich man said, well, look, I've got brothers, go and warn them. And they said, well, look, even if we sent Jesus, they won't listen. So,
Even if someone rises from the dead.
yeah.
So as you've sort of said, the concerns of fair trade, justice, paying workers fairly, in many ways are deeply connected to the concerns of the Bible.
Yes, very much so.
The questions just come in. So is the fair trade logo, is that something that the organisation or the producer pays to get, or do they just get it because they satisfy certain criteria?
Well, there's certain costs involved in monitoring, and naturally that someone has to pay for that. It's usually the organisation rather than the producer that pays. People also are promoting fair trade and trying to encourage more organisations, businesses to adopt fair trade as a way of marketing their goods.
But that's also where some of the potential challenges or the murkiness perhaps of the success of fair trade comes, because if you do have to pay for this certification, if you're very poor, it adds an extra burden to your cost of production, doesn't it?
Yeah, but in the long run, because you're being paid a fair wage in the end, it lifts the income for the worker, for the farmer.
So overall, those costs can be absorbed in the longer term.
Yes. So it's, for example, if it's a company, it's the company that's using the fair trade mark. They're absorbing that cost.
So closing it, wrapping up. So John, Dad, why fair trade?
Well, son, if we are really wanting the best for the people in this world, the people that we share this planet with, then we will want to purchase products that are produced in such a way that people receive a fair wage for the work they do.
And so why fair trade for you?
Well, it comes from a concern for people. I think that Jesus' great commands, first is to love God, second to love our neighbours. And for me, loving God by loving my neighbour is helping the neighbour that I can't see to a better lifestyle.
Let me leave you with the Bible's answer to the big question, why fair trade? From James 5:4. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. I look forward to you joining us next time for bigger questions. Please thank our guest today, John Martin, who is also my dad.
Enjoy bigger questions? You can help us keep asking them for as little as $1 a podcast. Support the show. Go to patreon.com/biggerquestions.